One of the most important aspects of writing dialogue is your characters' voices. Every character should have their own unique way of speaking. The 60-year-old math teacher probably shouldn't sound the same as their middle school student, and the students themselves shouldn't sound exactly like each other. There are a lot of factors in play when determining the way someone speaks. If you're a beginner, you might think this is easy. Just give each character a unique accent and a catchphrase. And while these are things you can definitely do, there's a lot more that goes into it. Character voice is not only how your character speaks, but also what they choose to talk about, how much they talk, when do they speak, and with whom. It's all aspects of communication, and each one of your characters should have their own unique way of doing it. Voice is going to impact both the dialogue and the prose itself. Even if you're writing in third person, the way your character thinks should dictate the way the story itself is narrated. But how do you come up with a character's voice? First things first, you need to know your character. And I don't mean knowing their appearance and a few of their traits. I mean knowing your character. Knowing all their inner workings and nuances. I made a video about how to write better characters. In case you're interested, watch it after this one. But I'll go over some things that you should consider right now. Your character's personality. Dialogue is a great place to expose characterization. The way your character speaks reveals a lot of who they are as a person. For example, a spoiled person who's entitled might demand things being done their way. They'll always find reasons to complain to other people with very harsh words because they believe that they are superior, while a humble, kind character will put others' needs before their own, always asking people if they're okay and if they can help with anything. So, look at your character's traits and think how they'll affect the way they talk and think. Your character's story. Unfortunately for most of us, we are a byproduct of everything that happened to us. After crafting your character's backstory, try to pinpoint events and situations that molded them as a person, and think how they inform the way your character speaks. A character who has been through a horrific accident might be very dismissive of smaller problems, always brushing them off as nothing. As for them, they really are nothing. Or a character who has a lot of younger siblings. They might talk in a more nurturing, motherly way. Another important thing to keep in mind is the way they were raised. How their legal guardians treated them, what was expected of them. A character who was always expected to be perfect might struggle with self-hatred as an adult, as they never got to the level they thought they had to. And the character who had very strict parents might have gotten the habit of making excuses instead of telling the truth. So basically, think about what was expected of them and how that affects the way they interact with other people later in life. If they continue the same, are trying to change, or even if they went full 180 and are acting exactly the opposite way. How do they respond to problems? Everyone has their own way of dealing with stress, and you should know your characters. Do they shut down and stop talking? Do they become aggressive or passive-aggressive? Or do they focus on conflict resolution in the most logical way? Next, where they're from. The place you grew up in can influence the way you speak in more than one way. Not only you'll get used to the local accent, slang, and idioms, but it will also shape the way you see the world. Think about the culture your character grew up in, how they were taught to see the world, and if they agree with it or reject it. What brings me to, how do they see the world? In my opinion, this is probably the most important aspect. Everything your character thinks, their biases, their prejudices, will leak through in their dialogue. Think about what your character values the most. For example, a character who thinks the most important thing in life is money. They'll be sure to emphasize how expensive their clothes are, even if it's not particularly relevant to the conversation. They'll look up to rich people, idolizing them. As for people with less money, they'll treat them badly, judging their life choices, totally disregarding everything else. A character who values family the most will always mention their siblings in their anecdotes and will emphasize the importance of sticking together. So basically what you're looking for here is your character overall views and opinions, the lenses in which they see the world through. And of course, this will be based on their backstory. How do they see themselves? Your character's self-perception not only will affect the way they see themselves, but also everything else. What are they insecure about? What are they proud of? How self-aware are they? People tend to be very good at identifying their own insecurities in other people. So maybe that's the first thing they will notice when meeting someone new. What's their profession? Most people spend most of their awake time working, and the longer you spend doing something, the more space it will take in your mind. And that means the things that you work with will probably affect the way you speak and think. Like using technical jargon even when you're outside of work, and using metaphors and comparisons based on their field. Like a fisherman saying the situation is going to be an easy sail. Use this sparingly, though it can get annoying and artificial if that's all they talk about. I've said profession, but you can consider hobbies for this too. Your character's arc. As your character changes as a person, the way they think and speak will also change. So keep it in mind. Other things you should take into consideration are their age, their level of education, and even the genre of your story. Okay, now that we've talked about a specific character, let's talk about the cast as a whole. How does your character speak to different people? It's very unlikely they'll talk to their boss and their partner in the same way. So, what differs? I'll make a video about character relations, but I'll go over some basics here. Unless your cast is very small, you won't be able to make your character speak in a unique way with every other character. The number of combinations will get overwhelming very quickly. So, think about the default way they talk and use that for the characters they don't have a strong opinion about. Then pinpoint the characters they have a reason to speak differently to, considering things like familiar bonds, affection levels, power structures, and conflicts, and then figure those ones out. So a character who's very hardened and aloof. Maybe his default is talking very little and only when it's important, using objective and direct language. But when they're with their sibling, they become very vulnerable and open and start revealing things about themselves that they wouldn't tell anybody else. Think about what roles each character serves in a conversation. This is not a rule that you're going to follow 100% of the time, but you can assign general roles for your characters. Like for example, the voice of reason, the clown, the heart. Consider each of your character's personality and think what will generally be their contribution to conversation. Not only it will make it easier to write group dialogue, but it will also give you the chance to change dynamics and creating interesting scenes. So maybe in a tense scene, the clown, who's generally trying to find humor in things, will start acting like the voice of reason, becoming very stoic and trying to solve the problem. This will show your audience how serious the situation is, and also show a different side to this character they thought they already knew. Until now, I've been talking about understanding your characters in order to write for them. But now I'll talk about more specific things related to speech itself. Think about all I've said to this point as the reasons they speak the way they do. And now let's talk about how this translates into words. First, let's talk about word choice. This is probably the most obvious element. The easiest thing to notice about a character's voice is the words they use. What I like to do is to create a list for each character, and I'll start writing words they commonly use for different situations. Like in greetings, do they say hi, hello, howdy? What adjectives do they like to use? What curse words, if any? And I also like to go through synonyms of commonly used words, picking some alternative ways and assigning them to fitting characters. You can also give them verbal tics, where they'll tend to add words or phrases into their sentences. My advice is to use this with caution. You can start sounding cartoony if you overdo it. But maybe that's what you want, in which case, go ahead. Other thing you should consider here is your character's vocabulary. What and how many words do they have access to? A character who hasn't received formal education might have a more limited vocabulary, but if their whole life they've been around woodworkers, for example, they might know an extensive amount of technical terminology relating to it. So look back at your character's education and life experiences when determining this. What figures of speech do they use? Figures of speech are basically creative uses of language, and many of them are present in everyday conversation. I recommend you research more about this, as I won't have the time to go over every single one here, and they can be very useful and interesting, so go ahead. So I'll put a link in the description, check it out. But I'll go over some. As I've already said, your character's life experiences will probably determine the kind of metaphors your character is going to use. But do they even use metaphors? If your character is too logical when literal thinking, they probably won't, or at least they'll struggle with it. But a poet will probably sneak a metaphor or analogy into most of their sentences. Euphemisms are gentle ways of saying difficult things, with the intention of reducing the impact of the words, like saying someone has passed away. Most people do this to some extent, but you might want to write a character that doesn't care that much about people's feelings and that doesn't use euphemisms at all. On the other hand, we have hyperbole, which is basically exaggerating. A character who's very dramatic might say they almost died, when actually they just tripped and got a bruised knee. Irony is very popular and can suggest your character being cynical or captious. Puns, well, are puns, and will show your character is trying to be funny and is actively making jokes. Simile is comparing things that are unrelated. If your character is very imaginative, they might do this a lot. For example, saying the room is as cold as Antarctica. As I've said, this is a very interesting topic, so please go study it. Next, sentence structure. This is the way your character constructs their speech. This includes the general length of their sentences, the order in which they put the words, and the words themselves. At last, a very important thing I want to say is, maybe don't worry too much about a lot of this during your first draft. A lot of it will come naturally to you, and overthinking it in the beginning might do more harm than good. So finish writing and then look back at the things that you have figured out and the things that you haven't. And then try to implement these things. So this is it. I'll make a lot more videos like this one, so if you liked it and are interested, please consider subscribing. And thanks for watching all the way through.